You guys are going to learn a thing or two today. We're going to do some schooling. It's apparently become a thing that I wear band t-shirts. I obviously also play music, and if you want to hear my single, New Ways to Hate Old Friends, you can click this link. Because of these two things, I've been asked about my musical influences, so I'm going to tell you about them. I don't remember getting much musical influence from my parents. My father wasn't around, and I only vaguely remember him having terrible taste in music. My mother's abusive boyfriend, who lived with us after they got divorced, listened to country radio, and my mother liked a handful of good groups. She was a big Beatle maniac when she was young, and she introduced me to the Monkees, who I always liked. Otherwise, I just listened to whatever was on the radio up until I became a teenager. I mean, the first piece of music I purchased on my own was the soundtrack to Transformers the movie, on cassette tape. The 1986 one, not the Michael Bay one. Believe it or not, that soundtrack still holds up today and has some great heavy metal songs on it. By the time I was a teenager, I was gravitating towards the heavy metal and rock music that was on the radio. Metallica, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses. I only had a couple of friends, and they were kids that started getting into death metal. With them, I started listening to Slayer, Deicide, Napalm Death, that kind of thing. But I never really got into the harder stuff. Those friends are the ones that stuck with death metal and didn't really get into the punk scene with me. In junior high, I started meeting other kids that were more like me, and this is when grunge really hit big. I grew up in a small town outside of Seattle, so grunge was huge for us. Of course, we loved Nirvana and Soundgarden, but that wasn't enough, so we would go to Seattle and search the music stores where we found Mudhoney and Green River. These bands were even more raw than the more commercial grunge bands, and I think that's what opened us up to punk music more. I don't remember what the first punk band I listened to was. It might have been the Misfits, but I know Epitaph Records was a big introduction to punk for me and my friends. I think Bad Religion and NoFX were some of the first punk bands I listened to consistently. I know that NoFX's White Trash, Two Hebes and a Bean was their newest album at the time. It was and still is one of my favorite punk albums. Generator was Bad Religion's newest album, but once I started going back and getting into their older albums, those were definitely more up my alley. No Control and Against the Grain are top-notch albums, and I feel like all of their albums since have progressively taken a step down in how much I like them. I continued to like, and I still do like heavy metal and grunge music, but punk music really struck a nerve with me, and I immediately identified with the culture. My friends and I were outcasts. This was the early 90s, and dyeing your hair, having tattoos and piercings, and dressing differently were not as accepted as they are today. Hell, a guy having a shaved head was completely unacceptable at the time where I grew up. So when I showed up to high school with my head shaved, besides a small group of bright pink spikes on the front of my head, wearing a spiked collar and a dress, it's safe to say I was called all sorts of derogatory names. The rest of my friends were either other punks or skateboarders, and we embraced our individuality. With that, I dug into punk rock and wanted to listen to every punk band that existed. Of course, I quickly found the other more notable punk legends, like the Descendants and All, Minor Threat, the Dead Milkmen, and Black Flag. I was never a fan of some of the bigger punk bands like the Dead Kennedys or the Sex Pistols. I think I just didn't identify with them enough. I found Operation Ivy, who had recently broken up, but Rancid soon had their debut album, which became an instant favorite of mine and turned Matt Freeman into one of my biggest bass-playing influences. Eventually, I just started finding punk record labels and going through their catalogs. Back then, we didn't have the internet, so you had to write to the label and ask them to mail you a catalog. I could travel about an hour to Seattle and check out a few small indie record stores for the albums I was looking for, but usually I would have to send in a mail order form to the record label and have them mail me the cassette tape or eventually the CD I wanted. Then I'd wait about a month to actually get the album I was wanting. I think it almost made the music sound sweeter because there was so much anticipation before I was finally able to listen to a band's album. Back then, Epitaph Records was still pretty limited. They only had a handful of bands, and unlike today, they were exclusively punk rock. They had Bad Religion and NoFX, and NoFX led me to Fat Records, which is where I found Propagandhi, who are to this day one of my all-time favorite bands. Pennywise and Down by Law were bands I liked back then and still listen to from time to time. Lookout Records was a huge part of my life, and I remember their catalog for a while was just a folded-up poster, and I think I just had it pinned to my wall. Screeching Weasel, The Queers, Mr. T Experience, and Squirt Gun were on a constant rotation in my bedroom down in the basement of my mother's old farmhouse. Then I started searching for even more obscure punk labels. Dr. Strange Records gave me Face to Face, who recorded their debut album in the same studio I would eventually record my band's album, which we'll get into. Also on the label was Guttermouth, who had some decent early stuff, but didn't really continue to make music I was in love with. Zoinks was another fairly obscure band that I found on Dr. Strange that I really loved. BYO Records was started by the members of Youth Brigade, which is a band I was never really into, but I liked their label. They introduced me to the Bouncing Souls, who's another one of my all-time favorite bands. BYO also introduced me to a band called John Cougar Concentration Camp, which I think is one of the greatest punk band names of all time. Unfortunately, their music didn't rise to the greatness of their name. They also released Automatic Seven's debut album, which is another great band. There were some more hardcore punk bands like Gorilla Biscuits and Youth of Today I got into as well. There are so many good labels and bands to even mention, but throughout high school this was my life, seeking out and listening to punk music. Of course, you can't be obsessed with punk music without wanting to play punk music. I started playing the bass guitar when I was 14 years old, and of course, my friends and I formed various grunge bands over the years. We played a couple of talent shows in my junior high school, but in high school I started playing punk rock. At that time, my biggest influences were probably NoFX, Pennywise, and Rancid, so I formed a band called Evolution of Man that aspired to get signed to Fat Records. Looking back, it was painfully obvious that we weren't even close to being good enough, but we were hopeful. Again, this was the early 90s, and there weren't a lot of young people in bands like there are today. In my local area, we would put on shows and we'd play with a handful of other local bands. At the time, they were most notably a band called MXPX and another band called the Oddfellows Local, which was started by a kid named Ben Gibbard, who would go on to form a little band called Death Cab for Cutie. Eventually, Evolution of Man broke up, and I continued playing in another band I had formed called The Cooties, which was intentionally spelled wrong in order to separate us from the board game. Myself and the drummer of Evolution of Man joined Mike Herrera from MXPX, who switched to guitar, and another friend who was also on guitar. We played a lot of shows, and eventually our drummer, Tom Wisniewski, replaced MXPX's guitarist, and they began to gain success. After they were signed to an independent record label in Seattle, the label also released a Cooties album in 1996, but we broke up not long after. We were all just too busy doing our own different things. I played in a lot of bands after that. I started to shift away from punk music and started listening to more hardcore music. Shai Hulud, 18 Visions, and Snapcase. Boy Sets Fire is still one of my favorite bands. This was a period in my life in my early 20s that was probably the height of my self-destructive period. I was so full of hate and anger and didn't yet understand why I felt that way. So this hardcore music really resonated with me. I was in a few hardcore bands and played shows around Seattle, but eventually I met my wife and stopped drinking and then had kids. So playing music got put on the back burner. Over the years, I've always written and recorded music. I've probably written over 100 songs over the years, but I had an external hard drive stolen and lost a lot of that music. It's sad because there was nothing on that hard drive that the thieves could have benefited from. It just basically removed that music from my life. I do love writing and recording acoustic music. I've become a big fan of a sort of countryish artist called the White Buffalo. I never stopped liking punk music, but I've definitely gotten back into it in recent years. I think I got married and had a normal job and kind of fell into social norms for a while, but after starting my own business and quitting construction, I really opened my own eyes back up to my own individuality and have started embracing it again. I don't think people need to live inside these little boxes that are expected of them in society. My mother was never super supportive of me playing music as a teenager because she just expected people either went to college, which I clearly wasn't gonna do, or they got a job at the factory and worked there for 40 years and retired. But that's all she knew. Her dad worked at Alcoa Aluminums for 40 years and retired. Her brother worked for the Naval Shipyard for 40 years and retired. That was the social norm. But I've always said, fuck the norm. You can do whatever you want. And just to be clear, she didn't try to stop me from playing music, but it just wasn't serious to her. With current streaming music services lately, I can find anything I've ever wanted, no matter how obscure it was. They have Turning Point. They have Undertow. The fact that I can just pull up John Cougar Concentration Camp and listen to all of their released music is mind-blowing. There has never been a better time to be a music fan if you like old obscure punk and hardcore bands. Outside of punk rock, I listen to just about everything. I'm a music lover in general. In a single day, I could listen to Propagandhi, Bad Religion, Baby Metal, Pink, Shooter Jennings, and The Who. Lately, it is more likely you will enter my office to the sound of a punk band, but I like a lot of music. It's actually easier to list the genres I'm not a fan of, which is mainly most of pop country, jazz, opera, and reggae. If you want to talk more about obscure punk music or any music in general, leave it in the comments. If you have any other questions about me or my move to the Netherlands, you can leave that in the comments as well. If you like this channel, hit subscribe and you can continue on this journey with me. Thanks so much, and be safe.